Hey everybody, this is Brian Crescenti, news editor at Polygon, and I am here today as part of my game journalism mentorship with Andrea, who's also here. Hi Andrea, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Fine. You have no image, just FYI, just in case you didn't realize that. It's just a big.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to be working for me today.
That's okay. We'll pretend you're in the dark, thinking studiously. Just as a reminder, I say this every time. While I do work for Polygon, this is something I'm doing in my free time and has nothing to do with Polygon. So the same, of course, is true for the opinions expressed here. They're all my opinions. So having said that, last time we talked a little bit about, I guess, about a couple of things. But basically, we went over your story, Andrea, and gosh, I can't remember how we ended it. What was the topic? Was it what was it?
The story that we're going to be talking about today.
No, I mean because I did a little bit of we talked a little bit. We did a sort of we talked about
Yeah,
Gamergate
yeah, yeah.
last time. That's right. Okay, so this time we're going to talk a little bit about a story you're working on, but then we're going to segue into, I think this is a good fit for the story you're working on, into the art of interviewing, which is one of my very favorite things, one of two of my favorite things about journalism and obviously game journalism. But before we get there, let's talk about your next story. So the idea here was you did your news piece on the gamification of this Al Jazeera story, the pirate fishing story that ran last week.
Yeah.
And now what we're doing is you're going to be working on essentially a report, a longer story, a long read, a feature, however you want to call this, but a longer story that was sort of born out of the idea of the story you worked on, the news story you did. And in this case, what you want to do is something called the psychology of gamification. Don't use either of those words in your headline, by the way,
Yeah.
because no one will read it.
Yeah, yeah.
But it is a great pitch. Actually, do you have that pitch handy? I have it here, but do you have that up?
Yeah, I have it open.
So can you read what your pitch was to me? Just down to you don't have to tell me where you say the experts I plan to talk to. Just read what the actual pitch is.
Okay. So starting with the recent release of Al Jazeera's pirate fishing and the success of other interactive news games like Budget Hero, the New York Times Dialect Quiz, etc., the trend towards interactive stories is clear. Want to explore how and why these gamified stories are effective transmitters of information, what impact these stories will have on the public, and why these kinds of stories are emerging now, perhaps because of the unhappiness with traditional news reporting and competition for attention, etc. And then this long-form piece would investigate how news organizations can and do use games to explore articles, stories, current affairs using interviews with experts in the field of psychology and news games. Would also be interested to cite the limitations of such pieces. Gamification is not fit for all news, and there are certain ethical quandaries that arise when gamifying news.
Excellent. So this is, I think, a fantastic topic. It's a really good pitch that you wrote up. So if you're writing, freelance or something like that, I think that's exactly how you do it. You go on to mention experts, which is also good to include in a pitch because people, I think, editors want to know you're not going to just write, a big opinion piece. That you're actually going to go out, do some reporting, do some interviewing, and come back with something that has a lot of substance to it. So you've done that here. Now the experts you mentioned, I think all good experts include a researcher at University of Rochester on how the brain learns, researcher at the University of Wisconsin-Madison about cognitive. Wait, what is it about how humans learn specifically in regards to perceptual, cognitive, and motor skills? And then Ian Bogost, who is author of News Games and has himself created some games like this. Jane McGonigal, a game designer that I think a lot of people know, and then a couple other folks who support news games. I would add to that a couple of ideas. I think you should reach out to Kuma Games if they're still around.
Mm-hmm.
They're an organization that's been around for quite a while. What they do is they take, or what they used to do if they're not around, is take events that have occurred in war and recreate those as first-person or third-person shooters that a player plays through. Very interesting for multiple reasons, not least of which is the genre that they're using to explore news. But also, I think it's interesting because in the field of gamification of news, when you're taking something like a first-person shooter and using it to impart information, I think there's a lot of ability to sway what people take away from that. So, for instance, when not Osama bin Laden, we'll say Osama bin Laden. When Osama bin Laden was killed, they turned that into a game, and one could argue that in doing that, they could have made the AI guards give up. They could have had them, as soon as you land, give up and put their hands up and allow players to shoot those people down in cold blood. Or they could have had all these people waiting with rocket launchers and trained and traps and everything. And both of those takes would deeply influence the way you feel the handling of that, how the handling of that was done. So you could come away thinking the U.S. shouldn't have killed Osama bin Laden, and really it was a cakewalk, and they could have gone in there and arrested him, or they had no choice. So I think that, that's a really stark example, which is why I think they'd be good to talk to. But that's the sort of stuff I think would be interesting to explore. Along with, I really like your idea of examining how people sort of ingest information and what they do with that information depending on how they get it. So that's where the psychology, of course, comes in. The other thing I'd suggest, maybe you don't need to use this because you have a lot of experts, but I always like to talk about this group because it is a fantastic resource called ProfNet. It's PROFNET.com. If you go to that website, you have to log in. It's a free login for journalists. And what you do is you log into this service, and then anytime you want to, you can go in and say, I'm looking for an expert on, and I use this at least once a month. I often use it even more. But I'm looking for an expert on fear. So I'm working on a story right now that would entail having doctors and psychologists explain what fear is, where it comes from, why people like it, how we react to it. So I went to ProfNet and said, hey, I need some experts on fear. I need someone who can talk to me about the physiological result of being afraid and the psychological impact of fear. And so you go in there, you type your little, it's sort of like a pitch letter, but it's a little thing explaining what you're looking for. You say if you want it to be hidden so people won't know who you work for, and that's if you have competition out there you're worried about. You type it, you select the type of people you want to respond, so it can include bloggers, PR people, professors, authors. You select what region, I always say the world, and then they send it out for you, and inevitably I always get responses. And I've used this service for all kinds, like I used this service once to write about why zombies in video games, or zombies in general in pop culture, years ago had gone from being the result of something religious like voodoo or the Second Coming to the result of science gone awry. Mm-hmm. And they ended up finding this psychologist who'd written books about fear and mythology and Frankenstein for me. Like, how awesome is that? Like, I would have never found that on my own. So anyway, it's a great resource. Definitely keep it. I'm not saying you have to use it for this, but maybe send out a query. You don't have to use them. Again, it's free, and the only twist I think is that on the flip side, my guess is that these universities and experts and everything probably are paying ProfNet because they get, it's like a PR marketing for them. Yeah. But there's nothing I've seen about it that makes it seem unethical. Like you're getting real experts, you get real professors and real authors, and you can judge them on your own. Anyway, that's my suggestion. In terms of your pitch, I think it's very good, as I mentioned already. I would go ahead and start working on getting some of these interviews set up and done. And that segues absolutely perfectly into the topic. You see how I did that?
Nicely done. Nicely done.
Thank you. So let's talk about interviews. I made a bunch of really rambly notes. I try to sometimes write this stuff up, but frankly, I'm so busy, I end up writing bullet points that are in no order whatsoever, which makes me sound very confused. So first off, the first thing I want to say is, I mentioned earlier, I love interviews. The art of the interview is one of two things that I adore about being a game journalist. The other thing is writing. And really, that, as I've said before, that is what makes up game journalism, or any journalism. It's the writing and the reporting. There are other elements of writing other than sitting down and actually writing. You have to sometimes come up with the structure and flow of your story. You have to work with editors. But the part I love the best about writing is literally the writing. Same is true for reporting. There's a bunch of elements to reporting. There's research. There's going to the scene of things. There's, depending on what you're doing, database work. There's all kinds of things. But the thing I love best about reporting is the interview. The interview is just fantastic, and it also leans on all of these things. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the art of the interview, because while on a sort of basic level, it's about asking questions. There's a lot more to it than that, especially if and when, and you will grow as a reporter and a writer and an interviewer, I'm sorry, you'll want to know these things. So let's start with what I would call a cheat sheet. So these are the things that you want to always sort of know. These are just real basic rules about doing interviews that everybody should know if they're doing interviews for publication. And these include everything from setting up the interview to, you know, when you're writing the story. So you always want to identify yourself when you're interviewing someone. Don't ever allow them to get into an interview with you thinking you're someone you're not. I think that's unethical. There are times where people have done this. I had a professor who was covering the civil rights movement. I'm trying to remember if he did this, or I think it might have been a friend of his who did this. But he allowed the medical examiner to assume that he was an FBI agent when he wasn't. He never lied to the guy and was able to get to the autopsy reports, which showed all these people had been shot in the back. It's a very important story. So there, like I said, there are gray areas. He never lied to the guy. He allowed the guy to jump to a conclusion, and because of that, was able to right a terrible wrong. But in general, that's not what we're doing. I mean, at least in video game coverage. So there's really very little reason why you should allow someone to assume that you're another developer or whatever. You know, if you're at a preview event and they mistake you for someone that you're not, you should be very upfront and tell them. In fact, a great example of this, I won't say who it is, but I had a meeting at DICE, which is a big thing held every year in January in Las Vegas. And I'd set up an interview through a intermediary, a PR person, company, and was meeting with this developer. The thing about DICE is that they have meetings all day long, these developers, and probably 90% of those meetings are with people in the game industry. So they're meeting with business people to try to get money, or with publishers to try to get deals, or with other developers to talk about technique. And then there's a 10%, the small amount where they're talking to press, but they don't do a lot of that. So I go into this interview, sit down with this guy, and I'm talking to him about a very big property, and not even in video games, a IP that's huge. Mm-hmm. And it becomes super clear to me that about 15 minutes, seriously, maybe 10 minutes into our interview, where he's told me all these things that are like astounding big pieces of news, like movies that hadn't been announced yet, that probably won't be announced still for another year, and video game properties, and all this other stuff. And it's becoming increasingly clear to me that maybe this guy is like being way too frank with me. Maybe he doesn't understand who I am. Part of it was he asked me, when we started, I said, I'm going to record this. And he kind of made a joke like, okay, like he thought that was kind of weird. But I put down my recorder, and I said, I just don't want to get anything wrong. And he thought that was weird. But then as I was taking notes, at one point he's like, you're not going to use any of this, right? And I said, well, yeah. I said, this is an interview. And he's like, well, hold on a second. What kind of interview? I said, I'm a reporter. All the blood drained from his face. Now, I set up this interview as a journalist with someone who knew I was an interview reporter for a story. The person who set it up knew very much why I did it, set it up with someone, telling them that they were going to an interview, introduced me as Brian Crescenti from Polygon, and I started out by saying I was recording it for I said for an interview. But still, this guy told me all these things that broke contracts that would have gotten him fired, and this was a very high-up person. And I ethically, I would have had the right to write that story, but there's no way I would do that. Like, that's insane. He was talking to me because he thought I was a developer or a business person. And he really did. He was freaking out. I said, look, don't worry about it. I'm going to erase this right now. We'll start all over again. You obviously didn't know I was a journalist. I'm not trying to trick you out of information. Not in this way. I like to trick you fair and square. But I'm not trying to trick you out of information like this. So I erased it and we started over. Unfortunately, the whole interview was a mess because he was so freaked out we just couldn't get anything out of him. But the point is, always ID yourself. Make sure they understand it. If they don't, you have to be very careful about using that information on the record. Now, When setting up interviews, you should always try to explain the purpose of the interview. It's very different than giving them questions. I never give people sample questions. I don't like to, and frankly, personally, I find it almost insulting when people ask me for questions ahead of time, because the whole point is me doing a live interview is for me to ask the questions, not for some person to sit down with a group of people and come up with answers and figure out what those answers should be and then feed them back to me. It's supposed to be a conversation. So I will tell them what I'm working on, what I'm hoping to get out of the interview, but I will never share questions. Make sure once the interview starts that people understand that the story, the interview is on the record, and that you're going to quote them by name in the story. There are people out there who don't have good media training, especially when you're covering indies. And some other people. Usually big companies do media training, but there are a lot of people who don't necessarily understand that, so make it clear. Don't waste the interviewee's time. You are there to do an interview, not to, with the exceptions I'll be talking about in a bit, not to chit-chat about your favorite games or about your home life or about how you adored them since you were a child. They don't have time for that. This is a business. You are supposed to be a professional, so and Andrea, don't take any of this personally. I'm not saying you're not any of these things, but I'm saying just in general, you're there to do a job. They're there to do a job. There are things you can do to make it an enjoyable, non-robotic experience, but everything you do in that interview is with purpose. So don't ever go there just to chit-chat and have fun, because that's not really the point. Make sure that in doing this interview that you're asking questions of someone that can answer them. So don't go talk to a developer and I'm trying to think of a really good example. Don't get someone to answer a question that they really don't know the answer to. That's really what this boils down to. You don't want someone talking about something that, like the developer of game A talking about game C when he or she has never worked on that game, knows nothing about that game, it just happens to be in the same company. Don't do that, because they may tell you bad information and it puts them in a bad situation and you in a bad situation. So try to find a not perfect, but a good fit for your interviews. Don't feel bad about trying to seek clarification. If they say something and you don't quite catch what they're saying, or they say something and you're thinking, what? That doesn't make any sense. Stop them and say, hey, I'm sorry. I don't quite understand what you're saying here. Can you explain it, or can you repeat yourself, because I think I maybe misheard you. That doesn't mean when they say something that's like, holy shit, I can't believe they just said that, you should necessarily say, whoa, why did you just say that crazy thing? And I've been in a lot of interviews where that's happened. If they clearly are saying something that they mean and you clearly understand it, you don't have to stop them and say, whoa, you just said something that's really crazy and people are going to freak out about. That's not your job. You should certainly explore and examine that train of thought to be able to give context to their comments. But yeah, don't ever interrupt a good quote just because it's sensational, if that makes sense. When it's necessary, be pushy. If you were talking to EA about the SimCity and why it doesn't have online, or that there are problems with online, don't feel bad about asking that question over and over and over again. If they keep ducking the answer, keep pushing it, not necessarily, and we'll talk about technique, but not necessarily all at once, but keep you need. Push it until they basically give you the answer, or say, I'm not going to tell you. And even then, you can kind of try to approach it a few times. I do that all the time. I'm not a hostile interviewer, but I am a pushy interviewer. Avoid and I've said this already sort of, but avoid lecturing, avoid arguing, avoid debating. This is not your chance to get your personal feelings across to someone you're interviewing. This is your chance to have questions answered and to learn something from this person that can be shared in a story. Remember, you're there for your audience, not for yourself. So getting into a debate is not going to help anything. Know very clearly what is off and on the record. If someone goes off the record, and I always do this, I will say, okay, this is off the record starting right now. And when they start to ramble back on the record, which happens 100% of the time when someone goes on off the record, stop them and say, okay, are we on the record again? And if they say yes, say, okay, moving forward from this point, we are on the record. Don't leave any sort of gray area there. Because then there's no accidents. And it's good if you are recording to make sure they say that they're back on the record while you're recording, in case that comes up. Okay, so those are your basic cheat sheet. Oh, last thing, make sure when you're setting up your interviews, if you're doing an in-person interview, find a good location if at all possible. Going to, the local, I don't know, library or coffee shop or whatever may not be a good idea because it's noisy, because they're in public and they feel like people might listen to them and it might put them at might make them feel uneasy. So try to find a location that is comfortable for them and for you, isn't distracting to anybody, and allows you to really have a good conversation. Okay, so now that we've gone through that, let's talk about what are essentially, I would say, the 4 major points of doing an interview. And those points are preparation, uh, establishing a relationship during the interview, the questions that you ask and how you ask them, and then how you listen and watch, listening and watching attentively to what's happening during this interview. So we'll start with preparation. Always make sure you are completely prepared for an interview. Make sure you understand what has been said about the topic, and certainly what's been said by this person about the topic, and make sure you're up to speed in all the information. So if you're a game, it's very easy to go through this. If you're writing about, I don't know, Battlefield, and you're writing about the latest Battlefield, make sure you know what's already been announced, so that you don't ask a question that's, they announced 2 days ago. Like, when's this game coming out? And they say, well, we announced that a week ago, and it's this date. It makes you look stupid. It makes them lose faith in your ability to do an interview, and it wastes time. And the time waster is the big deal. So do a lot of past story research. Research the subject matter. You've done a really good job with this in some of the stuff you were doing with your first story. But in this long-running story, The Psychology of Gamification, you can do a lot of research on psychology and gamification and really come to an understanding in your head of about what those things mean. It doesn't mean that you're going in with a predetermined slant on the story, or that you're not open to someone telling you, oh no, it's actually this thing. But if you go in there with what you feel is a deep understanding of the topic, you're going to be able to have a much better conversation with this person. And that's really what you want. You don't want an interview. You want a conversation. A good technique, a very good technique, is to list your questions ahead of time. So everything from the what is your name, what is your title, which you want to ask in 100% of your interviews. You also want them to spell their name, even if it's John Smith, in 100% of your interviews. Every single question, list out on a piece of paper. Then go through those list of questions and order them. I'll talk. Excuse me. I'll talk about that in a second. Come up with themes for your story. Again, this doesn't mean that you're going in with blinders on and you only want you have like what the answer is and the story is already. It means that you have in your mind some central themes that you want to explore. It could be that those themes fall apart and they're not stories. It could be that this one theme that you really thought was interesting is where you want the story to go, and it turns out there's this other thing out here, or this secondary theme you thought about, and it's way more interesting. So go with that one. You have to be able to think on your feet, but you also want to go in with themes because that helps you construct your questions. It also helps you get your mind around the topic and makes you feel more conversational when you're having this interview. Work on your flow. So let's talk about this when it comes to the questions. The biggest, most important thing you can do, I think, in an interview is make sure that your interview does not come across like you are reading out questions and expecting answers, and that you're not listening to them. This is, I think, the biggest problem I see in journalism when I see this. When I see a problem in journalism, people will sit down, they'll have the questions written out, which is great, do that. But then they'll literally read the question, the person will answer them, they'll type it down, and the person will be like, what is your name? And they'll say, my name's John Smith, and oh, by the way, I just killed 3 people. And they'll say, how old are you? And it's like, dude, he just said he killed somebody. Fuck the other questions. So, it's a conversation. Those questions are there because, yes, you should maybe ask them, and they're there to get your mind around it and prepare for it. But once you're in that game, don't take this and throw it out the window. Just keep that in your mind, but listen to them, and have a conversation. So the way you do this, the way you prepare yourself to turn an interview into conversation, is to build those themes that we talked about, And then in doing that, you then go back to your questions and you say, okay, I've got 20 questions. How can I put these in order so that they don't feel disconnected? It's sort of like writing. This is very similar to the process of looking at your notes and figuring out how you're going to establish a story. Your story has a flow to it. It's not a Q&A, hopefully. There are people who write. This is actually a common practice common mistake in writing in journalism, where they literally dump their notebook into their story. That's what I call that, and other people call that, is basically writing in reverse cron. So you will literally, the questions A, B, C, D that you asked and the answers A, B, C, D you got, you then put in your story in that order. So it might have some flow to it, but it still feels like people are kind of jumping between topics. That's not how you write, and that's not how you talk, and it certainly shouldn't be how you interview. So you look at your questions, and your questions may start off. Okay, let's do the psychology of gamification. You're interviewing Ian Bogust, and you start off by asking him a basic question like, what is the gamification? How do you gamify a news story? And then you want to ask him, does it have an impact on people? And you want to ask them about the psychology of it. And you want to ask him, are there ethical concerns? And what you do is you take those questions and think, okay, transitioning from how do you make this game to are there ethical concerns is pretty abrupt. But if I put in between those two questions, maybe what impact does it have? And then how do people read news and what's the psychology of it? And then get to ethics. It's a much smoother transition. So what you're doing when you're ordering your questions is essentially trying to figure out, how can I make this? This is like the SAT test, where they give you like 4 paragraphs of a story and you have to put it in the right order. It's essentially what you're doing, but you're doing it for questions. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that totally makes sense.
Okay, so it's very important because a lot of people don't do this. I know some great reporters, even reporters I work with now, who when they do interviews, they jump back and forth between topics. Don't do that. You want to try to make it smooth, because the whole key, everything you're doing is trying to put your interviewee at ease. Not because you want them to spill beans, though that would be fantastic, or to say something they shouldn't say, but because you want them to be a human being. You don't want to write a press release. You want to write a story that came from a person and what they really think and what they really feel. And you want to get them into your story. And to do that, you need to get rid of this barrier. And that barrier is, holy shit, I'm talking to a reporter, and everything I say is going to show up on a million different computers around the world, and I could lose my job. This is what's going through their head when you're interviewing them. You need to remove that so they forget that. Again, not to catch them or to get them to lose their job, but just to get them to calm down, relax, and have an interesting conversation with you. And that's where the best stories come from. So, where was I? Okay, so that's about ordering your questions. Once you do that, it helps you work on your flow. Your flow, working on the flow in an interview, is a combination of having questions in the proper sequence, listening to someone so you can completely leave that sequence and be comfortable with it, and also reading the interviewee. And this is why I love interviewing. It's like a chess game in many ways. You can't just, as I said, read the questions and write down the answers, but you can't also just listen and write down the answers. You have to be able to judge when a topic is becoming too prickly and when the interviewee is starting to shut down or get frightened or lose interest. And in doing that, you have to quickly, on the fly, adjust your questions to kind of, bring them back up to that space you want them to be in. So it is a delicate balancing act, and it's almost performance. So there's a lot that goes into this, and I think it's a lot of fun. But again, you follow these rules, and it makes it a lot easier. So we talked about how do you get prepared. So that's basically the best way to get prepared. Next, in an interview, I talked a little bit about this, but you want to establish a relationship in this brief snapshot of time where they feel comfortable talking to you. They're not going to talk to you in any real way unless they feel like you're really there, that you're listening to them, and that it is a conversation and not a grilling. So don't be nervous. Any nervousness you feel is going to be projected onto them, and they're going to get nervous. And it's also very good not being nervous. It helps them realize that you're just having a conversation and that it isn't a scary thing. I find sometimes if someone's really nervous about interviews, I won't take notes. Instead, I'll record the whole thing because, me sitting there, I don't have my keyboard handy anywhere, but me sitting there with the laptop in front of me, pounding away while I'm talking to them, it's the same thing when I do phone interviews. When they can hear, I have to go somewhere where I won't take notes. While I'm talking to them, it freaks them out sometimes. I've actually had people tell me that. And it's funny because I don't type down the things that I don't think are relevant. So someone will talk for 3 minutes and they hear nothing. And I know in the back of their head they're like, why didn't he write that down? So you have to think about all these things because that's what they're thinking about. So they're going to be nervous. You don't need to be nervous. This is your interview. You know what you're doing. You spent all this time preparing. You're rock solid. So your job is to get them to talk and to calm them down and make them not nervous. You want to have a sense of confidence, but you also want to have a sort of sense of closeness with the person. Again, don't lie. Don't. It's not a it's just between you and I moment. Don't make them think you're not going to share this information. But also don't go out of your way to make them feel like everything they're saying to you is being shouted through a megaphone. So just get them to relax. You also want to empathize. You have to be really careful about this. I go back to my days as a police reporter. I don't know if I ever told a victim or a family member's victim that I knew how they felt, which is something I heard, I think, 100% of the time from any other reporter who was at scenes who interviewed people. I didn't ever say that because the fact is it's a bold-faced lie. I don't know what it's like to have my daughter shot. I don't know what it's like to lose both of my legs in an avalanche. I have no idea what that's like. It's terrible for them, and I wish them the best, and God, I can't believe they're going through it, but I sure as hell don't know what they're going through. And that's what I mean by being careful about how you empathize. Don't bullshit somebody. Don't tell them something that you don't really feel. The trick to empathy is actually being empathetic. That's not a word. It's actually empathizing. I'm going to look up what that word is. So the trick is actually caring. And of course, remember all the ethics rules and everything else. You can't care too much. This is why journalism is such a tricky thing. You can't care so much that when they say something they shouldn't, and you got them to say it because you were having a conversation, that you don't run that story. Because that's not your job either. Your job is to inform the public, not to watch out over someone's career. So you've got to be careful. So anyway, you want to establish this relationship in a conversation that is short, and that's hard to do. There are some ways you can do that, and some of this leads into the way you ask questions and the questions you ask, which is really a big part of this. So let's go into questions now. So I've said this before, a good interview isn't a series of prepared questions and boring answers. It's actually a conversation. Make sure when you're talking to someone, when you're asking them a question, that you're listening. Don't ask the question, write down the notes, and then, I am sure we've all had that moment where we've had a conversation with a friend who is distracted, who's not paying attention to you. That's not how these interviews should feel, and they will if you're just going off your cheat sheet. Don't be afraid of asking the obvious questions or the mundane questions or even the stupid questions. Those are the questions that often lead to the best answers. I could think of plenty of times where I've asked something, and I will say this. I say this all the time. Okay, I'm going to ask you a really stupid question now, and then I will proceed to ask a really stupid question. And a lot of times I get these fantastic answers. And the reason I get fantastic answers is because no one has asked the question. Like no one says, I can't think of a really stupid question right now that I'd love to think of an example, because I really do this a lot, and a lot of people do it. But it happens a lot where you ask something and someone will say, no one has actually ever asked me that question. And then they'll give you this answer, and you're like, that's actually really fascinating. Like, where'd you get your nickname? And it turns out they got their nickname because they used to work with Steve Jobs, and he was a real asshole, and that's what he called them. Like, stuff like that happens. You get these fantastic anecdotes, and anecdotes are great to be able to put into your story. So be conversational in your interviews. Be willing to ask these questions. Be willing to let them know that you are not an expert, because the fact is you're not. You're a journalist. Journalists are meant to be able to quickly dive into a topic and understand it. But there is no way as a journalist that you are ever going to comprehensively understand something as much as the people who live that thing. So be willing to tell them, look, I don't know what you're talking about. When you're interviewing someone at id Software, and they're talking about, or you're interviewing Sweeney at Epic, and he's talking about the intricacies of graphic design, you can stop them and say, look, I don't know anything about this. Can you explain this to me as if I'm a complete idiot, because I am? And get them to walk you through it in a way that actually makes sense. People love that. They love to have things explained to them. And again, put yourself aside. Don't be embarrassed, because this isn't you. You are an instrument for reporting. So don't worry about all the rules of, like, you know, in polite society, no one would typically do that because you don't want to embarrass yourself. But who cares? You know, you're trying to get to the questions, the answers that you need. When you ask questions, there are many questions you can ask, but there are open-ended questions and closed-ended questions. So you probably already know this, but an open-ended question is a question that could lead to any answer. So it could be something like, Andrea, why is it that you like being a game journalist? That's a very open-ended question, and you could answer in a million ways. Or I could say, Andrea, did you get a job yet as a game journalist? That's a closed-ended question, and it, you know, the yes or no. Those both are great types of questions, but you have to know when to use them. You don't want to ask somebody who, I'm going to keep going back to police reporting, but like, don't go to the scene of a crime, somebody who just got shot in a burglary, and say to them, how does it feel to get shot? Like, that's an open-ended question, but boy, is that stupid. Like, really? There's no right answer. There's no reason you would ask that question. It's idiotic. Maybe what you should say is, how many times did you get shot? That's a closed-ended question, but it's a really good fit. So know when to use those types of questions and use them well. Let's see, I'm just looking at my notes. When you're asking your questions, be pushy, be direct, be courageous, but don't be rude. There is no reason you should ever be rude. I've interviewed tons of people over the last 20 years, and it has included, you know, the gamut from man on the street or woman on the street all the way up to CEOs. I almost interviewed President Clinton. I got to wave at him, but I didn't. He ducked the interview because it was about Monica Lewinsky. But I've interviewed all kinds of people. I have never, ever, I don't think, asked a question rudely. I've asked rude questions, and I'll define what a rude question is, but I've never been an asshole about it. And what a rude question is essentially a blunt question. So you can ask blunt questions. You can be direct with somebody. You can ask something that you would never, ever in conversation ask someone, like, how much money do you make? Or, you last year were convicted of being a pedophile. Are you still a pedophile? Like, you would never ask somebody that, you know, at some sort of party at a friend's house, but that's not where you are. You're doing your job. So ask those questions and ask them fairly. Don't be an asshole about it. And there are plenty of ways you can get to those questions. Don't beat around the bush either, because another thing I have found is that those direct questions are often the questions that those people want to ask, because everybody's so afraid to ask them. You know, like SimCity. We'll talk about SimCity. A lot of people asked, but I could imagine a situation where people are doing interviews with the people who made that game, and no one out and out says, did you lie? Did you lie about the fact that this game required online? Or did you lie about this other thing? That sounds like you're being rude. You're not being rude. You're being direct. And that's absolutely okay. Don't get emotional about it. But, you know, sometimes a direct question is absolutely needed because you need a direct answer. And if they won't tell you, that's fine. But you need to get them to say, I won't tell you that. And that gets back to being a little bit pushy. So let's talk about junk questions. I love junk questions. So remember how I talked about how it's a conversation. It's not. It's a conversation from their perspective. As I said earlier, from your perspective, it is a chess game. Maybe it's war. You are sitting there. You have planned for this. You've done all of this research. You know everything you can about this person. You know what they've said. You know all kinds of things about the topics. You even come up with your questions. You've ordered them. You've put them in an order that you think is going to flow nicely. You've set up a location that's not going to make them uneasy. You're careful that you don't ask boring questions, that you don't linger too long on topics that are off topic. That is not a conversation. That is you preparing for basically an extraction of information. Again, you don't want them to know that, but that's what you're there for. So this is about you finding things out, not telling people how smart you are. I'm getting off topic a little about junk questions. I'll get back to that. But when you're doing these interviews, you can broach topics that will make people feel more comfortable talking to you. So you're talking about Grand Theft Auto, and again, don't ever lie, but you could be talking about Grand Theft Auto with one of the Hausers, Dan Hauser, and your story, well, I'll use a specific example. Your story's about addiction and how they treat addiction, not in Grand Theft Auto, in Max Payne. And in having that conversation, you can say, my studies, I looked into this, and I know that when people are going through are severe alcoholics, they can have these signs and symptoms. That's fine, because you're establishing. You're not saying that to establish your level of expertise. You're saying that to introduce a topic, a theme, which is, these effects that happen when someone is drinking too much, and that should be used to then, as a launch platform, be used to then be a launch into this topic of questions. But don't sit there and say, my father was an alcoholic, and these are all the things I learned about him. And then when we were in treatment, we did, and then you end up spending half of your interview basically showing this person how smart you are. They're not there for a lecture. They're there to answer your questions. So don't go there to try to impress them. Don't go there to try to be friends with them. Go there to do an interview. So I'm sorry. Back to junk questions. Junk questions. So when you are doing your interview, a big part of an interview is figuring out who the person is you're going to interview. Some people are very good at interviews. Some people are very frightened of interviews. Some people have 3 minutes with you and don't give a shit. They'll do your interview. Reggie Fils-Aimé, he is on top of it. If you have an official interview with him and it's 15 minutes long, it will run 15 minutes. Not 15 minutes in 1 second. It will be 15 minutes. So you need to figure out, I have 15 minutes of time, and this is it. Like, I'm not going to talk to him again for months or maybe even a year. So I have to look at my questions. I have probably an hour's worth of questions, let's say, given how long his answers might be. I need to figure out what are my most important questions. Okay, so it's these 3. I have to get him to talk about these 3. And of these 3, there's one that's like, he's really not going to want to answer this one. It's coming out of left field. We're going to talk to him about sexism in Nintendo games. He really doesn't want to talk about that. I could ask him about why is the Wii U failing. He knows how to answer that question, and maybe I will ask him about that. But the sexism question, he doesn't want to answer it. So how am I going to structure my interview? Well, I don't want to waste time with him, but I also don't want to go straight into it and have him just leave the interview or stop the interview, which can happen. So how do you balance that? Junk questions is how you balance that. So junk questions are questions that you ask that you don't really care the answer. You don't care about the answer. You may get a good answer. You may use it. But those questions are distinctly designed to put your interview subject at ease. It's to make them understand, hey, I'm not here to eviscerate you. And you need to just relax and calm down. So my first question, often when I do interviews, is a softball question. So, hey, Reggie, how's it going? You guys announced the Amiibo, and that's really cool. Tell me a little bit about that. I already know everything there is that they're probably going to tell us about the Amiibo. And I know his answer is going to be 5-6 minutes long, and that I probably can't use any of it, but it's going to relax him a little bit. And it's going to get him conversational. Because when you start interviews, people just are not used to talking back and forth. So you have to kind of get them into it. So junk questions are used, throwaway questions, junk questions are used for a lot of things. They can be used to start off your interview. They can be used as sort of pumping the brakes. You're in the middle of an interview and you ask someone something and they get very upset and they act like they're going to stop the interview. Or like, I think I'm going to have to, time's running out. I don't know if we can go and do any more questions with you. So you throw in a softball question. Like, I meant to ask you, you guys released that game last year. It was fantastic. I really loved it. Can you tell me a little bit more about it? And that essentially, you've just slammed on the brakes and they've calmed down a little bit. And as they're answering it, they're relaxing again. So it's this give and take in your interviews. Don't go into interviews with only hard questions unless that's all you have time for. Try to balance your questions so they don't feel like you're there to screw them over. And then kind of use those questions back and forth. I often will ask the hardest question as my last or second to last question, because I always think, okay, this is the question I really am super interested in, and this is the question that's also got the highest chance of really pissing this person off if I ask it. And if I do this, they're probably not going to give me anything good after that because they're going to be so upset that they're going to be thinking about what they said for the rest of the interview. If that's the first question I ask them, the next 20 minutes will be them reciting PR questions as they, did I screw up that question? So I put that at the end. These are the sort of techniques and thoughts you have to put into your interview. The other thing worth pointing out is you're doing this, you're judging all of this as you're doing your interview. So you're having to react to them. And that goes back to the fact this is a conversation, or is meant to feel like a conversation. So you don't want to do this interview just asking the questions and checking them off. You have to be able to judge the person. Are they getting upset at you? Do they feel more talkative now? Maybe they changed the topic and it's a topic that you want to explore. Maybe, and this happens a lot, maybe they're deliberately controlling the conversation. Lots of people who are media trained will do that. Another trick they do, they will answer a question for 15 minutes if they know that your next question is a bad one and they only have 15 minutes with you. They will deliberately eat up the time. This is a debate trick, by the way. You do this in a debate that's timed. So what you do is you interrupt them. Don't be rude about it, but you say, "Look, I'm sorry. I hate to interrupt you, but I know we only have so much time, and I really need to ask you this question." But like, keep in mind, for them it should feel like a conversation. For you, it should feel like a chess match. Don't be rude, but be in control of that conversation. You don't want to come out of that and realize everything you got is something that you could have picked off of their website and their press releases. So go into this as a battle, not because you want to kill anybody, but because you need to be. It is an art form. It really is. There are so many aspects to interviewing that people don't even think about. Let's see. Okay, so I've mentioned this. Know how to read a person and back off when they get fidgety, change topics. Double barrel questions. I hate these. And you know what I hate more? Group interviews where someone double barrels your question. So here's a double barrel question. I'll do this to you, Andrea, because I'm picking on you. Andrea, did you kill someone yesterday? Oh, and can you tell me what you had for lunch? So which of those two questions do you think you're going to answer? Right, and I just gave you the option. I was like, here's two questions. Pick one. It's bad enough when you do it, and you should never do that because that is exactly what will happen. Someone will say, "Oh, screw that! I'm not going to answer the hard question. I'm going to answer the easy one, and I'm going to push the conversation that way." What makes it worse is when you ask a question and somebody else in the room who maybe isn't as good at interviewing or maybe isn't as trained at interviewing double barrels your question with a softball. So, Reggie, can you tell me why it is you've never had, I don't know. Why is it that you guys lost 50% market share last year? Oh, Reggie, I also wanted to find out what color the 3DS is coming in. Thanks, anonymous dude who just fucked up my question. They're certainly not going to be calling me again for a question, and they're not going to answer it because they're going to answer his question. So that's called double barreling. Don't do it. It's terrible, and they love it because it gives them an option. Be annoying, as I'm being right now. Like, again, it's a balancing act. Be annoying, but don't be so annoying you push them over the edge. But you need to get your answers. That means pushing people to that question. It's funny because I joke with interviewers all the time about it, but I get people. I don't trick people into answering questions, but I have gotten people to say things that they shouldn't be talking about, and they've even acknowledged it right after. They'd say things like, "Oh, I can't believe you got me to say that." It's like, that's my job. And again, it's not like, they're really mad about it. It's just like, wow, I don't usually talk about that. But like, that's where you want to be. You don't want them going over PR points. And rest assured, you had your list of questions. They have their list of answers. They have answers that have been written by a team of people. They have memorized those answers, and they are ready to spit them out at you as soon as you ask them. If you get to know someone in an interview, if you've done a lot of interviews with someone, you can actually recognize when they're accessing their brain to spit out that answer. And it's like, ugh. I know that with like Reggie. I'm like, when he starts to answer a question a certain way, I'm like, God damn it. I might as well type it up, but I could also just ask for the thing he's memorized because I know that this is an answer that he's given before. So this is in many ways a game. Like, it is interactive. You need to be in control. You can't be too much in control, but you really need to it's like riding a bull. It's like surfing. I'm going to keep coming up with terrible analogies, but it is not sitting on your ass and talking to somebody. It's mental Olympics. Now, speaking of that, while you're doing all this, remember, you're taking notes. You're trying to remember all those questions frantically that you were supposed to ask. You're trying to act like it's a conversation, not appear nervous, not appear pushy, but being pushy. While you're doing all of these things, you also actually have to pay attention. Because there's one part of you, the easy part is listening. That's like words come out of someone's mouth, you write them down, you notice when they change topics. That's all sort of analytical and sciencey, and do that. That's great. But then there's the emotional part, the artist part. And that artist part is, and I'll give you some terrible examples, but it's like not just listening, but like really listening. So be there in the moment. Pay attention to the fact that when you ask a certain question, the person starts getting jittery. They shake their leg. They start sweating. Notice the fact that he's always looking over your shoulder at somebody, or that he behaves in a certain way, or she behaves in a certain way. Those can all be elements of your interview. Those are all a part of being in the interview. Listen and watch. It's very, very important. Slips of the tongue can be meaningful. That doesn't mean they always are. You have to be very careful with this. Same with colloquialisms and accents. You don't want to mock somebody because of the way they talk, but if they talk in a certain way and it fits in nicely with the story and the things they're saying, then absolutely. I will give you a terrible example. I can't remember. I'd pull it up, but I think I did this only once, but I've done this before. I was interviewing someone about their mother who had passed away, and they talked to the person as if they were still, they referred to the person as if they were still alive. And I thought that was incredibly meaningful because it meant something. That's what I mean by being there in the conversation. You want to be able to pick up on these things. You don't want to nitpick somebody. You don't want someone to feel like you're making fun of them because they've got a Georgia twang in the way they talk. But if what they're doing and what they're saying and the way they communicate with you is meaningful, then put that in the story. The most important thing about an interview, my son's about to come in here, I think. The most important thing about an interview is that, and this is seriously super important, is that you shut up. Everybody needs to shut up when they do interviews. People talk too much. You want to ask a question, you want to get an answer. One of the most powerful tools in getting an answer from somebody is to not say anything. You ask somebody a question, and then you just stay quiet. And they'll answer it, and then the silence will fill and fill and fill. And eventually they will say something else because no one likes silence. It's uncomfortable and it's awkward, so they'll just say something. And maybe what they just say is something really that they mean from the heart and natural. So use that. But most importantly, don't get in the way. Don't talk over someone when they're saying something amazing. When someone is saying something you really agree with, don't be like, oh, yeah, totally, I know. Just shut up. Just let them say it. Because they're the ones that, you're not quoting yourself, you're quoting them. Don't get in the way of the interview. You have to be there, but you have to disappear in a moment's notice when they start being amazing, because that's what you want from them. So that's really, there's a lot there, and there's a lot of nuance to everything I just told you, and as I hope you're getting, interviewing is an art, it is a technique, it's not something that is as simple as just asking questions, it's something you have to build up over time. Do you have any questions? I know I just gave you a ton of material, but what sort of questions? Interview me, Andrea.
Oh, God. Well, actually, so I was thinking about my talk with Juliana because I was super nervous because it was my first ever like real interview. But when I had to step away from my computer because of the way the reception in my mom's house is, like it was actually much easier for me to like recall the questions I wanted to ask her, but also to be more conversational because I wasn't like staring at my computer freaking out about the next thing I was going to say.
Right.
But yes, so I guess because like, so much of an interview, like if I'm doing an interview over the phone, like there are a lot of things that I'm missing out on, like visual cues or like, all of that sort of thing. So I don't know if there's any tips you have for like how to make a telephone interview more awkward, or like how to push people to, or less awkward, not more awkward.
It's like more awkward.
Well, I don't need any help with that.
So the simplest answer is never ever do email interviews. Yeah. And that is because the answers you get back will not be from the person you're interviewing. Maybe not. Maybe sometimes it will be. But I mean, if someone, I never do this, but I don't know, if it was a really contentious topic, I would probably send those questions around to everybody and be like, can you guys help me write these answers so I sound super genius? There are a lot of people who don't do that, but that door is open. You have no idea who's writing those questions for you, or answers for you. Phone calls. Oh, I'm sorry. The other reason you don't want to do email interviews is because how do you do a follow-up? What, why did you kill someone? Yes. Did you? How old are you? 25. And it's like you never can say, what? Wait a second, you killed somebody? Or if they bring up some weird thing in their answer, you have to go through the rigmarole of trying to get them to come back, and like it's a mess. Doing email interviews, terrible, terrible, terrible. I do them, so I'm not trying to be mightier than thou. I do email interviews. We're in a busy world. I'm super busy. More importantly, typically the people I'm interviewing are way busier and just don't have the time, and it's the only way they'll do some interviews. There are some interviews I absolutely won't do as an email interview, but typically, if it's a routine interview, I'll make do with it. I don't like them, but they're not good to do. Second worst would be a phone interview, because you really can't. You can't establish a rapport. Often phone interviews nowadays involve 2 or 3 people on the phone. PR people have multiple times stepped all over questions and answers or interjected. The connection's bad. They use speakerphones. I can't hear half the things they say. It's a mess. I hate phone interviews, almost more than Q&A, like written ones. Next would be Skype. You could do a Skype interview and turn the video on, so you could see that over someone's shoulder they have Mickey Mouse ears and that frat dude from Animal House and a bottle of wine, I think. And you can, you could say, I noticed over your shoulder that there's a human head. Can you tell me a little bit about that? So yeah, use that stuff. But at least there's some presence there. The best interview, of course, is in person. We're so spread out to the 4 corners. It's so hard to do in-person interviews. That's why events are so great, because you can do in-person interviews. But yeah, it's the techniques for a phone interview. You can use a lot of the techniques I talked about. You can't recapture presence. You can't be there in a person's presence, but you can use some of those back and forths. You can have a flow in your conversation. You can, sort of pump the brakes when you need to. All that stuff can happen. It's just not as powerful as when you're there in person. Mm-hmm. So that's worth keeping in mind. I think I answered your question.
Yeah, no. So I guess my other question is, like, how do you, this is a silly question perhaps, but how do you set up an interview with someone? Like, am I just going to email, like, this researcher at, the University of Rochester, or, like, it's like, how do I do that?
Yes, it's very straightforward. Call and/or email the person. Explain to them in the email. Basically, just write something up saying, I do this all the time. Hi, my name's Brian Crescenti. I'm a reporter with Polygon. I'm working on a story about X. I was hoping to talk to you about X. Do you think you'd have time on X? I don't put X's in there because that'd be really weird. But I do that, and usually they get back to me. I mean, the reality is, unless you're interviewing someone about something terrible that they did, people love talking. And I'm a perfect example of that. I love talking. If I have time, I'll let anybody interview me, because why the hell wouldn't I want to talk about stuff? I'm awesome. I should be listened to. And that's how everybody feels. They love talking. If you're writing about them, it's like a double down, because everybody loves talking about themselves. It gets tricky when you want to talk to someone about topics that they don't want to talk about. And I know quite a bit about that. And the way you do that is you put them in a position where they have to. So I wrote a story about a town in Florida where myself and another reporter physically pulled a year's worth of tickets, traffic enforcement tickets, that this town wrote to people, and literally by hand typed in details from every single ticket into a database we created. We then crunched that database to figure some stuff out and determined that 97% of the tickets written by that town was a walled town. It literally had a wall around it, and it had asked the county for permission to write tickets on the street that ran in front of their town, but not in their town. 97% of the tickets they wrote went to non-residents. By the way, all residents had a bumper sticker that said they were residents. And they had a 1,500% increase in tickets on that street after they took over law enforcement on that street. Oh. Now, I couldn't say speed trap, but and that guy didn't want to talk. That police chief didn't want to talk to me. Absolutely didn't want to talk to me. And finally, after I had everything down, I sent him my information. I said, this is what I have. I don't need quotes from you. These are facts. There's no, There's nothing you could say. These are absolute. They have your officer signatures on every single ticket, and I have all the information cut and dry. What I would love to do is to include your voice in this story so that you can explain what this is, because I could tell you what it looks like, but I can't tell you what it is. You could tell me why this is the case. And if you want to have that interview, let's do it, and I will put everything you say in my story. And guess what? He did that interview. And guess what? He hated that story. Guess what? I never drove by that town. So you can force interviews. I don't think you're going to run into that a ton in video games. Either side of that, having the ammo you need to force an interview or needing to force an interview, but that does happen. And all it is a matter of good reporting. You get all the information you need, and then you go to the person and say, look, we have this story. Your inclusion in it is optional. It doesn't make or break the story. So the question is, do you want to have a fair say? Do you want us to include your voice in the story? If you don't, I understand that. I'm not going to attack you or anything. We are just going to present the facts. I think the story will be missing something if you're not in it, but I can't make you talk. And that's straightforward. That's exactly how you do that. Otherwise, like I said, people almost always will do interviews, unless they're super busy, and then you can try to work with them. But it's very rare that people are like, oh, I don't talk to the media.
Great. Well, that helps me out a lot.
Excellent. Any other questions?
No, not that I can think of. That, like, the flow and like setting up everything with the themes, that kind of answered a lot of what I was thinking about in terms of like how to wrap my mind about how to like structure the interviews in a way that didn't seem fake, and that seems like an easier way to do it, where it's just like a mental landscape, but not exactly like, this is, just gives you more freedom to talk as opposed to just reading things.
Right. If you're sitting there, if you haven't prepared, and this can happen. Like, there are times when you get an interview, Bill Gates walks up to you and says, "Hey, let's do an interview." You're not going to be like, "Well, I need a day to prepare." You need to go into that, and the more you do this, the more you'll be able to do this on the fly. Not the research, but hopefully you're sort of researched on, like, the more you cover a beat, the more you become generally knowledgeable about things. So yes, you could have deeper research, but on the spot, if you have to, you could probably talk about almost anything.
Yeah.
So that part is kind of covered. And then in terms of shaping your questions and making sure they flow, the more you do this, the more you can do it in your head. It really, and the same is for writing. Like, you just innately learn this ability to do that. What I would highly recommend, if you get nervous about asking questions, and that's very natural, is to write your questions. If you're doing an in-person interview and you're taking notes on your laptop, write your questions across the top of your document, and then stop being nervous. Like, you may or may not refer to those, but if you're like me, you'll be freaked out if you don't have them there. I'm not like that anymore, but I used to be. If I didn't have my questions written down, I would spend half my interview while talking to people being distracted by the fact that I may forget the question I was going to ask. And so I'd write them down, and then I'd never use them. But it was just like that safety net. And I was like, okay, now I can actually listen to them. So do that. Write down your questions. Have them there. Write them on a notepad. Whatever. It doesn't matter. Another very important thing, I didn't mention this in going through interviews. You're not doing a television interview unless you're doing a television interview. In other words, television interviews, you want to surprise people. You want to do gotchas. You want to. That's terrible. The exact opposite of what you want to do in non-television interviews is what you do in television, in my mind, because you don't want to slowly build them up to this peak interesting question and then lead off, which is essentially what I do in my interviews. In TV, they don't have time for this shit. They just want to start here and then be like, and then go away, and the person gets mad and leaves. Like, this is not. It is. I said earlier it was performance art. It's performance art for two people, not for the people who are going to read your story. So if you're beating around the bush to get to your question, not because you're afraid to ask it, but because you judge the person you're talking to and understand that if you go straight to it, they won't answer it, that's totally fine. Now, I would recommend. I'm sorry. Do you have any other questions?
No.
Okay. So here's my homework for you. I am going to locate a couple of interviews that I've both conducted and seen, both audio and video, and I'm going to send you links to them so you can listen to them, because I'd like you to listen to Flow and listen to the interviews. Don't worry about the questions or the answers. Just kind of pay attention. And for all of the interviews, it would actually be good if you could maybe just even take notes, like, okay, why did this happen? And that's why I'm going to probably rely mostly on mine. That, and I'm a massive egotist. But like, look at them and come back. We'll have another conversation and say, okay, Brian, why did you ask about this? Like, that was a waste. And we can maybe talk about, I mean, it could be that I just screwed up my interview, but also we could talk about, like, was there some reason I did that? Maybe at this point in the interview, I realized, okay, this is what I have to do. What I think I'm going to do is give you 2 interviews, and if you don't mind, the audio from my serial killer interview,
Sure.
which is super gruesome. I don't know why I laughed when I said that. I'm a dark person, that's why. Because that will give you, I think, a nice range of super friendly, super the opposite of friendly, and maybe I'll find one in the middle. And then
Okay.
you listen and watch, and then we'll have a discussion and see if you have questions about technique. All right?
That sounds great.
Okay, and then in terms of your other stuff, let's stop the broadcast. Bye, everybody, and then we'll talk about some of the details on your story.
Sure.
So thanks again, everybody who's watching this. I hope it was helpful. Feel free to comment below. I'm going to start doing that because there's stuff below. And that's it. Bye.